My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 32 years old now, living in a cozy apartment in Portland, Oregon, with my rescue dog Buster and a life I've built from scratch. But 15 years ago, I was 17, trapped in a nightmare situation in small-town Nebraska with my mother and her new husband, Derek. The night everything changed started like any other terrible evening in the Henderson household, with Derek's beer-stained tank top stretched over his beer belly and his latest creative punishment designed to break my spirit. "Sarah, get your worthless hide out here!" Derek's voice boomed through our double-wide trailer like a tornado siren, and I knew I was about to face another one of his twisted power trips. I'd been hiding in my room, trying to finish my AP history homework while listening to my iPod mini, the one thing my real dad had given me before he died in Afghanistan. Derek's heavy footsteps shook the thin walls as he stomped toward my bedroom, and I braced myself for whatever fresh hell he'd cooked up this time. "You think you're better than us with your fancy books and your college applications," he sneered, ripping my earbuds out and tossing my history textbook across the room. The book hit the wall with a satisfying thud that seemed to echo my own desire to fight back. "Well, Miss Princess, if you want to act like a wild animal, growling and snarling every time I try to discipline you, then wild animals belong outside." I stared at him in disbelief, watching his bloodshot eyes gleam with the kind of malicious satisfaction that told me he'd been planning this moment. My mother sat at the kitchen table, nursing her third glass of box wine and pretending not to hear what was happening. The familiar ache of abandonment settled in my chest, but it was quickly replaced by a burning rage that felt like swallowing lightning. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. Derek's smile widened, revealing his tobacco-stained teeth, and I knew he was absolutely serious about this new level of cruelty. The justice I'd been praying for since he married my mom 2 years ago felt impossible, but something in the air that night felt different, charged with possibility. "Dead serious, sweetheart," he drawled, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Pack up your sleeping bag and get comfortable with the great outdoors." My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom as I realized he meant for me to sleep outside all night. The October air in Nebraska was already carrying the bite of winter, and I could see my breath forming little clouds in the dim light from our porch. I grabbed my sleeping bag, my worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and my emergency phone that I'd hidden from Derek for months. As I stepped outside into the crisp autumn night, I had no idea that this would be the last night I'd ever have to endure Derek's abuse. Because karma was already preparing to serve him a feast of consequences. The stars above our little slice of rural America sparkled like diamonds scattered across black velvet, and for a moment I felt connected to something bigger than my small, painful world. Our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson's porch light was still on, and I could see her silhouette in the window, probably working on one of her famous quilts that she donated to the local women's shelter. That warm yellow light represented everything I hoped to have someday: a safe home, peace, and someone who actually cared about my well-being. I spread my sleeping bag on the wooden deck, trying to find a position that didn't make the cold seep through immediately. The deck Derek had built was warped and uneven, with splinters that caught on my clothes and gaps that let the wind whistle through. But as I lay there, shivering and angry, I had no idea that Mrs. Patterson had been watching Derek's escalating abuse for months, documenting everything with the patience of someone who'd seen too much injustice in her 73 years. Derek came out one more time to gloat, standing over me with his beer in hand. "Maybe tomorrow you'll remember to show some respect," he said, his words slurring together like the pathetic man-child he really was. The satisfaction on his face made my skin crawl, but I bit my tongue and waited for him to go back inside. What Derek didn't know was that Mrs. Patterson was already on the phone with Child Protective Services, speaking in hushed tones about the teenage girl being forced to sleep outside in freezing weather. Her voice carried the authority of a retired social worker who'd spent 40 years fighting for kids like me. The wheels of justice were already turning, even as I lay there feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. I must have dozed off around midnight, because I woke up to the sound of car doors slamming in our driveway. Two official-looking vehicles sat under our dim streetlight, and I could see badges glinting in the darkness. My heart started racing, not with fear this time, but with something that felt suspiciously like hope. The knock on our front door was firm and professional, the kind of knock that said, "This is not a social call." Derek's voice exploded from inside the trailer, a stream of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. The beautiful thing about karma is that it always arrives at exactly the right moment, usually when the person who deserves it least expects it. "Mr. Henderson, we're from Child Protective Services and we need to speak with you about your stepdaughter," came a woman's voice that cut through Derek's blustering like a hot knife through butter. I sat up in my sleeping bag, hardly daring to breathe as I watched my salvation unfold. The warmth that spread through my chest wasn't from my sleeping bag. It was the warm embrace of knowing that someone, somewhere, gave a damn about what happened to me. Derek stumbled outside in his boxer shorts and undershirt, clearly having been awakened from his drunken stupor. "What the hell is this about?" he demanded, swaying slightly as he tried to focus on the two CPS workers and the police officer standing on his deck. The lead CPS worker, a no-nonsense black woman in her 40s, looked from Derek to me with the kind of professional assessment that missed nothing. "Sir, we received reports that you've forced a minor child to sleep outside in October weather as punishment," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that made Derek step backward. The police officer, a tall Hispanic man who reminded me of my high school history teacher, was already taking notes and photographs. Justice was finally showing up to our little corner of nowhere, Nebraska, wearing a badge and carrying a clipboard. "She's not my kid. She's just living here," Derek protested, as if that somehow made child abuse acceptable. The CPS worker's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into her hairline, and I could see her mentally adding that statement to her growing list of violations. My mother appeared in the doorway, still clutching her wine glass and looking like a deer caught in headlights. "Ma'am, are you Sarah's mother?" the CPS worker asked, turning her attention to my mom with the kind of pointed look that demanded honesty. Mom nodded mutely, probably calculating how much trouble she was in for allowing this to happen. The officer stepped closer to me, and his kind eyes reminded me that there were still good people in the world who protected kids instead of hurting them. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall in the most satisfying way possible. Derek tried to lie his way out of it, claiming I'd chosen to sleep outside, but Mrs. Patterson appeared from her house with a manila folder full of documentation. She'd been photographing and recording Derek's abuse for months, turning her quilting room into a surveillance center for justice. The folder contained timestamps, photos, and detailed notes that painted a clear picture of escalating abuse. "This child has been systematically abused and neglected," Mrs. Patterson declared, her voice ringing with the moral authority of someone who'd spent her life fighting for what's right. Derek's face went white as he realized that his elderly neighbor had been building a case against him. The beautiful irony was that while he'd been calling me a wild animal, he'd been the one behaving like a predator, and now the hunters had become the hunted. The CPS worker reviewed Mrs. Patterson's documentation with growing amazement and fury. "Mr. Henderson, you're looking at charges of child abuse, neglect, and endangerment," she announced, her professional calm cracking slightly to reveal her anger. Derek started backing toward the door, but the police officer was already moving to block his path. "You can't prove anything," Derek stammered, but his bravado was crumbling faster than a stale cookie. The officer gestured to me, still sitting in my sleeping bag on the deck, with the evidence of Derek's cruelty literally spread out for everyone to see. The case against him was so clear that even a public defender would probably suggest he plea bargain. What made the moment even sweeter was watching my mother finally find her backbone. "Derek, how could you do this to my daughter?" she whispered, her wine glass slipping from her fingers to shatter on the deck. The sound of breaking glass seemed to wake her up from 2 years of willful blindness, and for the first time since she'd married Derek, She looked at me with something resembling maternal instinct. Sometimes rock bottom is exactly where someone needs to be to finally start climbing back up. The CPS worker knelt down beside me, her voice gentle but urgent. "Sarah, honey, we're going to get you somewhere safe tonight, okay?" she said, and I started crying. Not from fear or sadness, but from pure relief that someone was finally taking charge. The officer was already on his radio calling for backup and probably a social worker, while Derek continued his pathetic attempts to talk his way out of consequences. "I want to press charges," I announced, surprising everyone, including myself, with the strength in my voice. Derek's eyes went wide with panic because he'd probably figured that even if CPS got involved, I'd be too scared to take it further. The satisfaction of watching his face crumble was like winning the lottery, Christmas morning, and the 4th of July all rolled into one perfect moment. Mrs. Patterson wrapped a quilt around my shoulders, one of her beautiful handmade creations that felt like being hugged by an angel. "I should have acted sooner, honey," she whispered, but I just hugged her tight because she'd acted exactly when she was supposed to. Her kitchen light was still on, and I could smell the coffee she'd been brewing while she waited for help to arrive, a beacon of comfort in what had been the darkest period of my life. The police officer helped me to my feet and guided me toward one of the official vehicles. "Sarah, you're incredibly brave," he said, and something in his voice told me he'd seen situations like this before. Derek was still arguing with the CPS worker, digging himself deeper into legal trouble with every word. "This is America! I have rights!" Derek shouted, apparently forgetting that children also have rights, including the right not to be abused by power-hungry stepfathers. The officer's smile was grimmer than a funeral as he started reading Derek his rights. The sweet sound of "You have the right to remain silent" had never sounded more like a symphony to my ears. As they loaded Derek into the police car, he kept insisting that he was just trying to teach me discipline and respect. The CPS worker shook her head in disgust, probably thinking about all the actual parents who would give anything to have a child to love and protect. Watching Derek's face through the police car window as he realized his life was about to change forever was like watching karma serve up a 5-course meal of justice. My mother stood in the doorway crying, finally understanding that her choice to enable Derek's abuse had cost her everything that mattered. The CPS worker approached her with paperwork and a stern explanation of what would happen next. She'd have to complete parenting classes, undergo counseling, and prove she could protect me before I'd even be considered for returning home, which honestly sounded like the beginning of the healing we both needed. Mrs. Patterson insisted on riding with me to the emergency placement facility, her weathered hand holding mine as we drove through the empty Nebraska streets. "Your daddy would be so proud of how strong you've become," she whispered, and I knew she was right. The warm glow in my chest felt like my father's presence, watching over me and making sure I finally got the protection I deserved. The emergency foster home was run by a former teacher named Carol Martinez, who had converted her farmhouse into a safe haven for kids in crisis. She met us at the door with hot chocolate and homemade cookies, her smile genuine and warm in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. Her living room felt like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life, with overstuffed chairs and family photos that spoke of real love and stability. "Welcome home, Sarah," Mrs. Martinez said as she showed me to my temporary room. And something about the way she said it made me believe that good things were actually possible. The room was small but clean, with a soft bed and a window that looked out over cornfields stretching to the horizon. For the first time in years, I felt safe enough to sleep without listening for footsteps in the hallway. The next morning brought news that made my heart sing with vindication. Derek had been formally charged with child abuse, neglect, and endangerment, and the prosecutor was considering additional charges based on Mrs. Patterson's documentation. His bail was set high enough that his minimum wage job at the grain elevator couldn't cover it, which meant he'd be staying in county jail while awaiting trial. Even better, my mother had immediately filed for divorce and was cooperating fully with the investigation. She'd apparently found her spine somewhere in the bottom of that wine glass, because she was giving statements that would ensure Derek never got the chance to hurt another child. The legal system was moving faster than I'd ever seen it move, probably because the evidence was so overwhelming that even the slowest wheels of justice couldn't ignore it. Mrs. Martinez drove me to school that morning, and I walked through the halls feeling like I was floating on air. My friends crowded around me, having heard through the small-town grapevine that something major had happened at my house. When I told them the story, their cheers echoed through the hallway like the sound of freedom itself. My English teacher, Miss Rodriguez, pulled me aside after class with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I always knew you were destined for great things," she said, handing me a college application packet she'd been saving. "Now you have the chance to make them happen." The weight of possibility felt heavier and more wonderful than any burden I'd ever carried. The trial 3 months later was like watching every courtroom drama I'd ever seen, except this time I was the star witness, and Derek was the villain getting his comeuppance. He'd aged 10 years in jail, his smugness replaced by the haunted look of someone who'd finally realized that actions have consequences. The prosecutor painted a picture of systematic abuse that made the jury visibly angry, and Mrs. Patterson's documentation was presented like evidence in a murder trial. Derek's lawyer tried to argue that making me sleep outside was just tough love, but the prosecutor shot that down faster than a clay pigeon at a skeet shoot. "Tough love doesn't involve endangering a child's health and safety," she declared, and I watched several jury members nod in agreement. The defense was weaker than gas station coffee, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, the courtroom erupted in cheers that felt like the entire town celebrating justice. Derek's face crumpled as the judge sentenced him to 5 years in state prison, plus mandatory anger management and a permanent restraining order. The sound of the gavel coming down was like music to my ears, the final note in Derek's symphony of stupidity. My mother was in the courtroom, having completed her parenting classes and 6 months of intensive therapy. She approached me afterward with tears streaming down her face, ready to apologize for the first time since Derek had entered our lives. "Sarah, I failed you as a mother, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it up to you," she promised, and something in her voice told me she meant it this time. The beautiful thing about surviving abuse is that it gives you superpowers you never knew you had. I finished high school with a 4.0 GPA and a full scholarship to the University of Nebraska, studying social work with a specialization in child protection. Mrs. Patterson attended my graduation, beaming with pride as I walked across the stage in my cap and gown, ready to help other kids who were trapped like I had been. College was like stepping into a completely different world, where professors encouraged my opinions and classmates treated me with respect. I thrived in the academic environment, making the dean's list every semester and working part-time at a local nonprofit that provided services to abuse survivors. Every success felt like another nail in Derek's coffin of irrelevance, proof that he hadn't broken me after all. My mother and I rebuilt our relationship slowly, with family therapy sessions that were sometimes painful but always productive. She'd stayed sober since Derek's arrest, channeling her energy into becoming the mother she should have been all along. Watching her fight for her sobriety with the same determination I'd used to survive Derek was like witnessing a miracle in real time. During my sophomore year, I got word that Derek had been attacked in prison by inmates who didn't appreciate men who abused children. He'd survived, but with injuries that would remind him daily of his crimes, which seemed like exactly the kind of poetic justice the universe specialized in. The news didn't make me happy exactly, but it did make me feel like the cosmic scales were finally balanced. Mrs. Patterson and I maintained our friendship throughout college, with her sending care packages filled with homemade cookies and hand-knitted scarves. She'd become the grandmother I'd never had, proof that sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you'd expect. Her house remained my safe harbor, a place where I could return to remember how far I'd come. I graduated summa cum laude with my bachelor's degree in social work, and Derek was still in prison, having added more time to his sentence for fighting and contraband possession. The irony that I was thriving while he rotted behind bars wasn't lost on me, especially since he'd always predicted I'd amount to nothing. Success, it turned out, was the best revenge, served ice cold with a side of justice. My first job was with the same CPS office that had rescued me, working under the supervision of the woman who'd stood on our deck that night and changed my life forever. She'd become a mentor and friend, teaching me how to navigate the system and fight for kids who couldn't fight for themselves. Every case I worked felt like a chance to be someone's Mrs. Patterson, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. The day Derek was finally released from prison, I was accepting an award for my work with abuse survivors, speaking to a room full of professionals about the importance of early intervention. He'd served his full sentence, plus probation, and would be labeled as a sex offender for the rest of his miserable life. While I was building a career dedicated to protecting children, he was filling out forms that would ensure he'd never be trusted around kids again. I heard through the grapevine that Derek had moved to another state, living in a run-down apartment and working at jobs that barely paid minimum wage. His dreams of being a big shot had died in that prison cell, replaced by the reality of being a convicted child abuser. The man who'd once terrorized me with his power trips was now powerless, dependent on the mercy of a society that had no tolerance for his crimes. My mother remarried eventually to a kind man named Jim, who treated me like his own daughter and understood the importance of rebuilding trust slowly. Their wedding was small but beautiful, held in Mrs. Patterson's garden with sunflowers blooming like golden promises of better days ahead. The joy on my mother's face was genuine this time, unmarked by the fear and denial that had characterized her relationship with Derek. I met my future husband in graduate school, a fellow social worker who understood my passion for child protection and shared my commitment to making the world safer for vulnerable kids. Our first date was at a coffee shop where we talked for hours about our work, our dreams, and our shared belief that broken systems could be fixed by people who cared enough to try. He proposed with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who'd fought for civil rights in the 1960s and understood the power of standing up for what's right. Our wedding was everything Derek had tried to steal from me, a celebration of love, family, and the future I'd built despite his attempts to destroy it. Mrs. Patterson was in the front row, crying happy tears and wearing the pearl necklace she'd saved for special occasions. My mother walked me down the aisle, her step steady and sure, finally the parent I'd always needed her to be. We bought a house in a neighborhood full of families, with a front porch swing where I could sit and remember the scared teenager I'd once been. Sometimes former clients would drive by and wave, young adults who'd aged out of the system and were making their own way in the world. Their success stories became my success stories, proof that the cycle of abuse could be broken with enough love and determination. Derek, meanwhile, had tried to contact me through social media several times, apparently thinking that enough time had passed for me to forget what he'd done. Each message was automatically filtered to my spam folder, where his attempts at manipulation belonged. The restraining order was still in effect, and I had no intention of ever giving him the satisfaction of a response. My husband and I eventually had 2 children of our own, a daughter named Hope and a son named Justice, because we believed in naming them for the things we wanted them to bring to the world. Raising them with love and respect felt like the ultimate victory over Derek's prediction that I'd never amount to anything. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee I kissed better, every proud moment at their school events was a testament to the parent I'd become despite the example I'd been given. Mrs. Patterson lived to be 91, surrounded by the dozens of children she'd helped save over the years through her quiet vigilance and fierce love. Her funeral was packed with social workers, teachers, police officers, and former foster kids, all of us united in our gratitude for a woman who'd made protecting children her life's work. I delivered her eulogy, my voice strong and clear as I told the story of how she'd saved my life by refusing to look the other way. The last I heard of Derek, he was in his 60s, living alone and working part-time at a gas station, his health failing from years of poor choices and the stress of being a registered sex offender. He'd never remarried, never had children of his own, and had burned through what few relationships he'd managed to maintain. The man who'd once wielded power over a vulnerable teenager had become exactly what he'd always been underneath, a pathetic bully who preyed on those weaker than himself. My mother, by contrast, had become a volunteer advocate for domestic violence survivors, using her experience to help other women recognize the signs of abuse before it was too late. She'd turned her shame into purpose, speaking at conferences and support groups about the importance of protecting children from dangerous partners. Her transformation was proof that people could change if they were willing to do the hard work of healing. Today, I'm the director of the same CPS office that rescued me all those years ago, working with a team of dedicated professionals who understand that sometimes you're the only thing standing between a child and disaster. My office is decorated with thank you cards from families we've helped, drawings from children who are now safe, and photos of former clients who've gone on to college, careers, and families of their own. The work is hard, but every success story feels like personal vindication. Sometimes I drive past the old trailer park where Derek's double-wide used to sit, now replaced by a small playground where children laugh and play safely. The symbolism isn't lost on me. Where once there was abuse and fear, now there's joy and innocence. Mrs. Patterson's house next door has been turned into a small museum dedicated to local history, with a display about the importance of community involvement in child protection. The teenage girl who once slept outside in October, labeled a wild animal by a man who should have protected her, had grown into a woman who spent her life ensuring that no child would face that kind of cruelty alone. Derek's attempt to break my spirit had instead forged it into something unbreakable, shaped by adversity into a tool for justice. Every child I helped save was a small victory over the darkness he'd tried to wrap around my life. My children know their family history, age-appropriately told as a story about standing up to bullies and the importance of asking for help when adults behave badly. They understand that their mother works to protect other children because she knows what it feels like to need protection and not have it. Their compassion and sense of justice make me believe that the future will be brighter for the next generation of vulnerable kids. As I write this story, Derek is probably somewhere in America, still alive but insignificant, a footnote in the story of my success rather than the main character he once tried to be. His attempt to destroy me had instead revealed the strength I never knew I possessed, and his cruelty had taught me the importance of kindness. The wild animal he'd tried to create had become a fierce protector of other innocents, using her survival instincts to hunt down predators like him. The moral of my story isn't complicated. Bullies always get their comeuppance eventually, especially when they pick on someone stronger than they realized. Derek had mistaken my youth and vulnerability for weakness, never understanding that survival skills and determination could turn a victim into a victor. His biggest mistake wasn't just the abuse, it was underestimating the indomitable spirit of an American teenager who refused to be broken. Every day, I wake up in my beautiful home, surrounded by people who love and respect me, knowing that Derek is somewhere living with the consequences of his choices. The sleeping bag incident that was supposed to humiliate me had instead been the catalyst for everything good that followed. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened, because it shows you exactly who you're meant to become. And that, as they say in Nebraska, is how you turn a prairie fire into a controlled burn that clears the way for new growth. Derek thought he was punishing me by making me sleep outside, but he'd actually just given me the perfect view of the stars, and I'd been reaching for them ever since. The wild animal he'd tried to tame had evolved into something far more dangerous to people like him, a protector with the power to put predators in cages where they belonged.